What's going on, you guys? My name's Ty Knotts, and I've got an extremely interesting video for you guys today. So to start off with, I wanted to mention the 1,500 missing children that I'm sure a lot of you guys have probably already heard of. Now, the stories of this first broke out in late April of this year, and was alleging that the government had somehow lost 1,475 immigrant children. So more specifically, these kids were transferred to the Office of Refugee Settlement that was put in charge of 7,635 children. During their normal rounds of making sure all these kids were safe, they were able to confirm the safety and whereabouts of 6,075 of these kids. But for the other 1,475, they gave absolutely no response, with their whereabouts being pretty largely unknown. Now, an important thing to note here is that the headlines are a little bit deceptive with this one. This isn't technically the government's fault, but it's more specifically ORR's fault, or even the children's sponsors' fault. Because once these kids leave the care of ORR, or like I said, the Office of Refugee Settlement, full responsibility is given to their sponsors, and these sponsors are typically family, friends, distant relatives, acquaintances, people like that. But while this may typically and more specifically be the fault of the sponsors, it's still the fault of ORR for not doing better background checks and having better vetting processes to ensure that these homes are actually safe. That's 1,475 children that are just completely missing, strictly because ORR didn't do their part. And with the number of large-scale human trafficking rings on the rise in the US, it obviously brings up the worst of thoughts when talking about such a large number of kids. I mean, we all certainly hope it doesn't come to that, and I personally feel fairly certain that most of these kids are likely safe, and that they're simply unreachable, but honestly, it's just a horrifying situation for the parents and the loved ones of these kids to have to go through this. It's painful and terrifying to have to watch and be able to do almost literally nothing about. Hopefully over the coming months, these kids will start to turn up one by one, but we've really got to get this situation figured out for the future. It's honestly just unacceptable behavior for such a large-scale agency. But from there, I wanted to jump to a story that's actually about Lyme disease. So there is some really strange info that was compiled about the origins of Lyme disease back in April of this year. So Lyme disease is known to have first appeared out in the wild in 1975, but then from 1994 to 1996, the disease spread incredibly, with certain cities reporting up to 1,500 cases within a year. But what makes this all even more strange is that the majority of these cities were actually located extremely close to Plum Island, most of which were in about a 10-mile radius. And for any of you that may be unaware, Plum Island is known to have housed some of the government's biological testing facilities for biological warfare. So specifically, the building that we're talking about is known as Building 257 and housed countless US investigations into biological warfare. This all began back in the 1950s and eventually was ended by President Nixon in '69. But even after the lab shut down, the disease somehow made its way to the public, then nationally, then globally. Now, this is all completely just a theory. There's no definite proof of this, but it's an awfully big coincidence that the majority of these cases took place within such a close proximity to Plum Island. Also, it's not unheard of that the government would test or quote-unquote accidentally release biological warfare to test on its civilians. Just think about Operation Big Buzz from '55. That involved the government dropping 300,000 mosquitoes on its citizens, strictly for the purpose of testing how quickly mosquito diseases could spread. So I don't know about you, but this just seems like a little bit too much to be just a coincidence. Obviously, there's nothing we can really do about it other than be informed and try to prevent this type of thing from happening in the future. But it's just something to think about. And finally, there was a really incredible story that I wanted to share from the White House. Now, I don't normally cover any sort of modern politics, but this is huge news from the government and honestly huge news from Trump this week. So Trump plans to sign a bill known as the Right to Try bill that would allow terminally ill patients to try new and experimental medications prior to the FDA's approval, at least offering some of these people the chance of life, even if the outcome appears less than ideal. So this bill would allow certain medications that meet specific requirements that are going to be set up by the states individually to be tested by patients with, things like PTSD, cancer, any sort of largely terminally ill condition. These medications would include unreleased medications that, like I said, haven't been approved by the FDA, but it would also include things like cannabis and MDMA, also known as ecstasy, and even psilocybin, the psychoactive ingredient that's found in magic mushrooms. Now, the latter two are typically used in a controlled environment to help treat certain types of PTSD and stress or emotional-related mental illness, but the possibilities are honestly nearly limitless. In fact, there have been a lot of studies of people testing psilocybin in terminally ill cancer patients to help them kind of cope with that end-of-life mindset. So love him or hate him, this is a great move on Trump's part, almost inarguably. It's a huge step forward not only for Americans, but honestly for humanity as a whole. For a moment, it gives you the illusion that maybe some of these politicians actually have their heads on straight for a change. But we all know that's probably not true. But that's the video for today, you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to click that like button. If you loved it, be sure to share it and subscribe. But I've been Ty Knots. You guys have been lovely, and I'll see you in the next video.